We shouldn't have gone up there so late in the season. Looking back, that was our first and most fatal mistake. The cabin belonged to Ben's uncle, a lonely structure tucked away deep in the Cascade Mountains, miles past where the paved roads surrendered to rutted, unforgiving dirt. It was supposed to be a simple weekend of cleaning the place up for a quick sale, a final goodbye to a forgotten family relic. Just me, Ben, and Kira. We arrived just as the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the dense pines that crowded the small clearing like an encroaching army. The isolation hit us immediately. The air up there was different, thinner, sharper, and smelling deeply of pine resin, damp earth, and something ancient that I couldn't quite place. As we unloaded the truck, a heavy, suffocating silence pressed in on us from all sides. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was an expectant one, like the silence before a thunderclap. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Kira, who was usually the loudest and most cheerful among us, went quiet the moment she stepped out of the truck. She kept looking toward the dark, impenetrable tree line, rubbing her arms as if a cold draft had just hit her. "It feels watchful here," she murmured, her voice barely loud enough for me to hear over the wind. I brushed it off as city nerves, but as I carried the first box of supplies toward the rotting porch, the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something behind that wall of trees had just noticed us and was very unhappy we had arrived. The first night passed uneventfully, mostly because we were too exhausted from the grueling drive to notice much of anything. We drank some beers by the dusty stone fireplace, laughed nervously about the lack of cell service, and crashed early. It was the next morning when things started to feel undeniably wrong. I woke up before the others, driven from sleep by a thirst that felt like I'd swallowed a handful of sand. The cabin was freezing, the fire having died out hours ago. I could see my breath puffing out in small ghostly clouds in the dim morning light. I went to the kitchen to pump some water from the manual tap. The window above the sink looked out toward the back of the property, where the woods grew thickest and darkest. As I leaned over the sink, a smell hit me, a scent so violent it made me gag. It seeped through the cracks in the old glass panes, sharp, metallic, and overwhelming. It smelled like a jar of old pennies mixed with raw, spoiled meat. The distinct, primal scent of fresh blood. I unlocked the window and shoved it open, leaning out to see if maybe a coyote had killed a deer nearby. There was nothing but frost-covered brush and the towering pines swaying gently. But right beneath the window, in a patch of mud that hadn't quite frozen over, the ground was disturbed. It looked churned up, deep gouges in the earth like something heavy had been pacing back and forth in a state of agitation. The copper smell was so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. I slammed the window shut, my heart doing a nervous double beat. I decided not to tell Ben or Kira just yet. There was no point in scaring them over a dead animal. By noon, the weak autumn sun had burned off the morning frost, but the feeling of heavy unease hadn't lifted from the clearing. Ben was busy fixing a broken hinge on the shed door, his hammering echoing entirely too loudly in the quiet clearing. Kira and I were clearing brush away from the front porch, trying to make the place look presentable. She was still jumpy, her eyes darting around constantly. Every time a jay squawked in the high branches, she flinched as if she'd been struck. "Sam, come look at this," she called out, her voice tight and trembling. She was standing near the edge of the clearing where the gravel driveway met the soft forest floor. I walked over, wiping sweat and dirt from my forehead with the back of my glove. She pointed at the ground near her boot. The mud here was softer, shaded by the canopy of a large oak tree. Pressed deep into the soil was a single track. It was huge. That was the first thing my brain registered, the sheer impossible size of it. It looked vaguely like a wolf print, but the proportions were all wrong. It was too long, almost 7 inches from heel to claw tip. The pads were deeply set, suggesting massive weight, and the claw marks dug forward aggressively into the earth. But the strangest part was the way the heel elongated. It didn't look like an animal that stayed on 4 legs. It looked like something that could shift its weight backward, like a human foot, but warped. Probably just a big bear, I lied, trying to sound convincing for her sake. Kira looked at me, her eyes wide and fearful. Bears don't have feet like that, Sam, and they don't walk on their tiptoes. We tried to focus on the work, burying our anxiety in manual labor. Ben managed to get the shed door secure, and we cleared a decent perimeter around the cabin. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost pressurized. The normal sounds of the forest, the birds calling, the squirrels chattering in the leaves, began to fade away one by one. By 4 o'clock, the woods were dead silent. It felt like the entire mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. We retreated inside as dusk approached, locking the heavy deadbolt on the front door with a satisfying click. Ben built a roaring fire, but it did little to chase away the deep chill that had settled into our bones. We were making dinner, trying to keep a normal conversation going about movies and work, when the evening chorus began. It started low in the valley below us, a howl, but deeper and more resonant than any coyote or wolf I'd ever heard on nature documentaries. It sustained for an impossibly long time, a mournful, aggressive sound that vibrated in the cabin's timber walls. Then another one answered from the ridge directly above us, and another, closer this time, from the east. They weren't just howling aimlessly, they were communicating. They were triangulating our position with military precision. Ben dropped the cast iron skillet he was holding. The clang was deafening in the sudden silence inside the room. "What in God's name is that?" he whispered, his rugged confidence evaporating instantly. We all stood frozen, listening as the calls got closer, closing the circle around the cabin like a noose tightening. The howling stopped abruptly an hour after dark, cutting off as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against our eardrums. We were sitting in the living room, an old oil lamp burning on the table because the generator was acting up and sputtering. None of us wanted to go outside to fix it in the dark. We each had a mug of lukewarm coffee, our hands wrapped around them tight, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then we heard the impact. It wasn't a branch falling or a pine cone dropping. It was a soft, heavy thump on the shingle roof right above the bedrooms. It sounded sickeningly like a large, padded foot landing with calculated precision. We all looked up at the wooden ceiling planks, dust drifting down in the yellow lamplight. Another thump, then a slow, dragging sound, like heavy claws rasping against the asphalt shingles. It was moving slowly, deliberately, from the back of the cabin toward the front porch where we were sitting. The weight of it made the thick support beams creak and groan. It sounded impossibly heavy, way bigger than a man, perhaps 300 or 400 pounds. Ben slowly reached for the hunting rifle he'd brought leaning against the fireplace. His hands were shaking so badly I could hear his ring clicking against the metal barrel. We held our breath, tracking the sound as it moved directly over our heads, pausing right above the center of the living room. It stopped there. It knew we were in there. It was listening to us breathe. The scratching on the roof stopped, leaving us in a state of suspended terror. We waited for 10 agonizing minutes, hearing nothing but our own ragged breathing and the popping of the dying fire. Then Kira let out a strangled gasp and pointed a shaking finger toward the kitchen. The kitchen doorway was dark, leading into the unlit back half of the cabin. We hadn't pulled the curtains over the window above the sink, the same window I'd opened that morning. In the inky blackness of the night outside, something was pressed against the glass. It was just a flash, a momentary glimpse before it ducked below the sill, but the image burned itself into my mind like a brand. It was a face, but it wasn't human. It was high up, much higher than a person could stand unless they were 7 feet tall.
The skin looked like wet, matted gray fur, patchy and scarred. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. They reflected the lamplight from the living room, amber, wide-set, and radiating an intense, intelligent malice. It wasn't the blank stare of a wild animal wondering if we were food. It was a look of assessment. It was studying us, counting us, looking for weapons. Ben chambered around in the rifle, the mechanical ch-clack sound incredibly loud in the small room. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice trembling but firm. He moved slowly toward the kitchen, rifle raised to his shoulder. I grabbed a heavy fireplace poker, my palms sweating, and followed him, praying that the glass would hold.
Ben returned from the kitchen, pale and sweating, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "It's gone," he said flatly, his voice hollow. "But the window glass is cracked. It pressed hard enough to spiderweb the pane." We pushed the heavy oak kitchen table against the back door and nailed a spare piece of plywood over the window. It felt pathetic, like trying to stop a tank with cardboard, but it was all we could do. We decided we had to leave at first light. We'd pack the bare minimum and just drive until the fuel ran out. To do that, we needed to make sure the truck was okay. The truck was parked near the shed, about 30 yards from the front porch, swallowed by the darkness. "I need to check the tires," Ben said, pacing the room. "If that thing slashed him, we're trapped here like rats." I argued that it was suicide to go out there, but he insisted. We compromised. I would stand on the porch with the high-powered flashlight, covering him while he made a dash for the truck. I stood at the door, heart hammering against my ribs like a sledgehammer, and clicked on the beam. It cut a bright cone through the darkness, illuminating swirling dust motes. Ben took a deep breath and sprinted into the night. I swept the light back and forth, illuminating tree trunks and brush. Ben reached the truck and crouched by the tires. "They're okay," he yelled back, relief washing over his face. As he stood up to run back, I swung the light toward the shed behind him. The door Ben had fixed yesterday was hanging off its hinges again, and just inside the doorway, two massive amber eyes reflected the beam back at me, unblinking and cruel. "Ben, run!" I screamed, my voice cracking in terror. He didn't hesitate or look back. He bolted back toward the porch, slipping on the frosted gravel, his boots scrambling for traction. I kept the light trained on the shed door, praying the thing wouldn't charge, my hand shaking so hard the beam danced wildly. A massive, dark shape detached itself from the shadows of the shed. It stepped out into the moonlight, and my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It stood on two legs, towering over 7 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, humped with muscle that rolled under thick, dark fur. The head was canine, a massive wolf-like muzzle filled with serrated teeth, but it was set on a thick, powerful neck that looked more human than animal. Its arms were long, ending in hands with curved claws that glinted in the light like switchblades. It looked like a biological nightmare, a seamless fusion of man and wolf designed for killing. It threw its head back and let out a roar that wasn't a howl. It was a guttural scream of rage that shook the porch beneath my feet. Ben dove through the doorway, sliding across the floorboards. I slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the heavy security bar into place with trembling fingers. A split second later, a massive weight slammed into the door, cracking one of the upper panels. Dust rained down from the frame. We were trapped. The siege had begun. We retreated to the center of the living room, the furthest point from any door or window, huddled together like sheep. Kira was sobbing quietly on the old sofa, her arms wrapped tight around herself, rocking back and forth. Ben sat in a chair facing the front door, the rifle across his knees, his knuckles white as bone. I paced, my mind racing, trying to find a way out that didn't exist, checking the windows over and over. Outside, the creature wasn't leaving. It was testing the cabin. We heard it prowling around the perimeter, its heavy footfalls crunching in the gravel. It would pause at each window, and we'd hear the sickening sound of long claws lightly tapping against the glass, searching for a weakness. Tap, tap, tap.
Then it would move to the next one. It was psychological warfare. It was playing with us. It knew it could get in if it really wanted to. The initial slam against the door proved its strength. It was savoring the terror, feeding on it. It moved to the sidewall where the fireplace chimney was built from river stones. We heard it scraping against the rock, climbing with terrifying ease. A moment later, heavy breathing echoed down the chimney flue, amplified by the stone shaft. A sprinkle of soot fell into the dead fire grate. It was on the roof again, sniffing at the chimney opening, considering coming down the chute. Ben aimed the rifle at the fireplace, sweat stinging his eyes. "Don't come down," he whispered. "Please don't come down." We sat in that agonizing standoff for hours, time stretching and warping. The oil in the lamp was getting dangerously low, the flames starting to sputter and dim, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like claws. "We need the generator," Ben whispered, breaking the silence. "If the lights go out completely, we're blind in here. We won't see it coming." The generator was in a small enclosure attached to the back of the cabin, accessible only from the outside. "We can't go out there," Kira whispered, her voice ragged and hoarse from crying. "That's what it wants. It's baiting us." Just as she said it, the single bulb on the porch, which was running off the last of the generator's fuel, flickered and died. The hum of the generator outside sputtered, choked, and then cut out completely. The silence that rushed back in was profound. We were plunged into near total darkness, save for the dying flicker of the oil lamp and the faint gray moonlight filtering through the cracks in the boarded window. Almost immediately, we heard movement at the back of the cabin, near the generator shed. Metal crumpled and tore with a screeching sound. It sounded like the creature was ripping the steel generator apart, piece by piece, like it was made of foil. It wasn't just destroying our light source. It was demonstrating its power. The sharp scent of gasoline began to drift into the cabin, mixing with that awful, underlying copper smell of blood. The gasoline fumes were getting stronger, making me dizzy and stinging my eyes. A terrifying realization hit me. "It's going to burn us out," I realized with horrifying clarity. "If a spark hits that gas, or if it lights a match, this whole wooden tinderbox goes up in minutes." We couldn't stay in the main room. The smoke and fumes would get us before the fire did. "The root cellar," Ben said suddenly, his eyes widening in the dim light. "There's a trap door in the kitchen floor. It's dug deep into the earth. It might be safer. It's the only place the fire won't reach." We scrambled into the kitchen, moving by feel in the dark, bumping into counters. I stubbed my toe painfully on a chair leg, but barely felt it through the adrenaline. We shoved the heavy oak kitchen table aside, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, revealing a rusted iron ring set into the floorboards. Ben grabbed it and pulled with all his might. The trapdoor groaned in protest, the hinges rusted stiff from years of disuse, but it finally gave way with a screech. It revealed a gaping black hole in the floor. A blast of cold, musty air rose up to meet us. It smelled of damp earth, mold, and rotted vegetables. It was a terrifying black pit, but it was better than waiting to burn alive above ground. As we hesitated, we heard a heavy thump against the back door again. The creature was losing patience. We dropped into the cellar one by one, lowering ourselves into the gloom. It was a shallow space, maybe 5 feet deep, with a packed dirt floor and walls lined with rotting wooden shelves holding ancient jars of preserves. I pulled the trapdoor shut above us, plunging us into absolute, suffocating darkness. The air was thick, cold, and hard to breathe. We huddled together on the cold dirt floor, knees pulled to our chests, listening. Above us, all hell broke loose. We heard the back door finally shatter inward with a tremendous crash of wood and glass. Heavy clawed feet stomped across the kitchen floorboards right over our heads. Dust and dirt rained down from the ceiling, coating our hair. The creature was inside. We heard it overturning furniture, smashing lamps, tearing cabinets off the walls in a frenzy. It was roaring again, that terrible guttural sound vibrating through the ground into our chests. It was hunting for us. checking every corner of the cabin. We held our breath, terrified that the sound of our own heartbeats, which sounded like drums in our ears, would give it away. I squeezed Kira's hand so hard I thought I might break her fingers, but she didn't pull away. We waited for the inevitable moment when it would find the trap door. The crashing above stopped suddenly. The silence was even worse than the noise, because now we didn't know where it was. We knew it was still there, standing in the kitchen, just inches above our heads, separated by only an inch of old wood. Then we heard the sniffing. It was a loud, wet intake of air right at the crack of the trap door. Sniff, sniff. It had found our scent. The sniffing continued, deep drags of air as if it were savoring the smell of our fear like a fine wine. It knew. A single long claw slipped through the crack between the floorboards. It was black, serrated, and curved like a scythe. It wiggled there for a second in the darkness, feeling the air, probing the space, before withdrawing. Then a massive weight settled under the trapdoor. The wood groaned under the strain, bowing downward. Dust poured down on us in a steady stream. The creature was right on top of the door. It let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate the very dirt we were sitting on. It knew exactly where we were. It wasn't searching anymore. It was just deciding when to open the
and eat what was inside. The terror was absolute. Kira couldn't take it anymore. The psychological pressure of being trapped underground in the dark with a monster standing on our only exit broke her. She let out a high-pitched scream that echoed deafeningly in the tiny cellar. "Kira, stop!" I hissed, trying to cover her mouth with my dirty hand, but it was too late. The damage was done. Above us, the creature went berserk. The low growl turned into a roar of triumph. It started pounding on the trap door with incredible force. Boom! 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 The hinges screamed as metal twisted. Dirt clods fell from the ceiling, pelting us. We scrambled backward against the dirt wall, digging our heels in, though there was nowhere to go. The wood began to splinter. A crack appeared down the center of the trap door, and a shaft of gray moonlight from the kitchen illuminated the dust-filled air. Through the widening crack, I saw a flash of dark fur and those terrible glowing amber eyes peering down at us, hungry and insane. It had broken through. We were seconds away from death. Just as the trapdoor was about to give way completely, and I was preparing myself to die fighting with nothing but my fists, something strange happened. The pounding stopped mid-blow. The creature went dead silent. We heard it lift its massive weight off the door. We heard its heavy footsteps moving away from the kitchen, back toward the living room. It was moving quickly, almost anxiously, its claws clicking on the wood. Then we heard another sound from outside the cabin. It was a whistle, not a natural bird sound, but a sharp two-note whistle, one high, one low, that sounded distinctly human. The creature let out a different kind of noise, a low whine, almost like a disciplined dog acknowledging a command from a master. We heard it burst out through the broken front door, its claws scrambling on the porch wood as it ran. Then, silence returned to the cabin above. We waited 5 minutes, then 10, shivering in the dark. Nothing. The immediate threat seemed to have vanished, called away by that impossible whistle. We looked at each other in the gloom, confused and terrified. Why did it stop? We waited another 20 minutes before we dared to move. The air in the cellar was growing stale, and my lungs were burning for fresh oxygen. "We have to check," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. He slowly pushed up on the damaged trap door. It lifted heavily, groaning on its bent hinges. He peeked out, rifle barrel first. The kitchen was demolished. The table was smashed to splinters, chairs were reduced to kindling, and the cabinets were torn off the walls. Moonlight streamed in through the shattered back door, illuminating the devastation. We climbed out of the pit, shaking from adrenaline and cold, our legs feeling like jelly.
The cabin was a wreck, but it was empty. The smell of the creature, that musky, wet dog scent, mixed with copper, hung thick in the air, coating the back of my throat. We stepped carefully through the debris into the living room. The front door was hanging off one hinge, swaying slightly in the breeze. The night outside was quiet again. Too quiet. "Who whistled?" Kira asked, her voice trembling. "Who else is out here?" That was the terrifying question. The creature was bad enough, but the idea that someone was out there controlling it, treating it like a pet, was infinitely worse. It meant this wasn't random nature. This was something else entirely. We needed to leave, now. We couldn't wait for dawn. The creature might come back, or whoever whistled might come looking for us. We grabbed the truck keys from the counter and the few supplies we hadn't unpacked, stepping over broken glass. We headed for the door, moving as fast as we could without running. As we passed the wreckage of a bookcase the creature had smashed in its rage, I saw something lying on the floor amid the torn paper. It was an old leather-bound journal that must have fallen from a high shelf I hadn't noticed before. It looked ancient, the leather worn smooth and dark. On an impulse, driven by a gut feeling I couldn't explain, I grabbed it and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. We didn't have time to read it now, but something told me it was important. We stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting our sweaty faces like a slap. The truck was still there, tires intact. It felt like a trap, like cheese in a maze, but it was our only chance. "I'll drive," Ben said, his voice hard. "You two get in the passenger side. Keep your eyes open. If you see anything move, scream." We made a run for it. 30 yards felt like 30 miles. The gravel crunched loudly under our boots, sounding like firecrackers. I fully expected the massive shape to burst out from under the porch or drop from the roof at any second to finish what it started. We reached the truck, and Ben fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so hard he dropped them once in the gravel. My heart nearly stopped in my chest. "Ben!" I hissed. He snatched them up, jammed the key into the lock, and threw the door open. We piled inside, locking the doors immediately. Ben cranked the ignition. The engine turned over, sputtered, and died. "No, no," he pleaded, slamming his hand on the steering wheel, trying again. The creature must have damaged something after all. Whir, whir, click. A third time. Whir, whir, vroom! The engine roared to life, the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Ben slammed it into reverse, tires spitting gravel as we backed out of the driveway faster than felt safe, fishtailing onto the dirt road. Ben threw the truck into drive and floored it. We fishtailed down the dirt road, the suspension groaning as we hit potholes, headlights bouncing wildly off the tunnel of trees, making the shadows jump and dance. We just wanted to get down the mountain, back to paved roads, gas stations, and streetlights. We made it about 2 miles before Ben slammed on the brakes, throwing us against the dashboard. The tires skidded on the loose dirt, bringing us to a halt just feet from disaster. The road ahead was blocked. A massive old-growth pine tree had fallen across the track. It was enormous, too big to drive over and too heavy for 3 people to move. "It wasn't down when we came up yesterday," Kira whispered horribly, staring at the trunk. "The wind hasn't been blowing that hard. That tree didn't fall. It was placed." It was a deliberate roadblock. We were trapped on the mountain. Someone had cut off our only escape route. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. "Reverse!" I yelled, grabbing Ben's shoulder. "Go back to the cabin. It's the only defensible spot we have." Before Ben could shift gears, we saw them. Not one shape, but 3. They stepped out of the woods on either side of the truck, illuminated by our taillights and headlights. They were identical to the one at the cabin. Massive, upright, wolf-like nightmares. They were huge, muscular, and terrifying. They didn't attack the truck. They just stood there, forming a perimeter around us, blocking us in. They were guards. And then, walking calmly out of the darkness in front of the fallen tree, came a man, dressed in heavy wool clothing that looked decades out of style, holding a gnarled walking stick. He looked completely unafraid of the monsters flanking him. In fact, he looked like he was taking a midnight stroll with his pets.
The man stopped 10 feet from the truck's grill, bathed in the harsh white light of the high beams. He looked ancient, his face a road map of deep wrinkles, his beard long and gray. His eyes were sharp and clear, looking right through the windshield at us. He raised a hand in a calming gesture, palm open. The creatures stayed still, their chests heaving, eyes glowing red in the taillights. They were waiting for his command, muscles coiled and ready to spring. This must have been the source of the whistle. He controlled them. "Roll down the window just a crack," Ben whispered, his hand tight on the rifle. "But keep the doors locked." I did as he asked. The cold air rushed in, carrying the overwhelming scent of the pack. Musk, wet fur, and pine. "You folks are trespassing," the old man called out. His voice was raspy but strong, carrying easily over the idling engine. "And you've riled up my guardians something fierce. You're lucky to be alive." "Guardians?" I shouted back, trying to keep the terror out of my voice. "They tried to kill us. They tore the cabin apart." The old man shook his head slowly, looking disappointed. "If they wanted you dead, son, you wouldn't have made it past the front porch. They were just herding you, keeping you contained until I could get there to assess the situation." He took a step closer, leaning on his stick. "This mountain doesn't belong to your uncle. It never did. His cabin was built on land that's been protected for centuries. These woods hold things that the rest of the world forgot. My family, we're the keepers. We make sure what's in here stays in here, and what's out there stays out." He gestured to the massive beasts flanking him. "They don't like strangers. They smell the city on you. They smell fear. It makes them aggressive. They are the border patrol, and you crossed the line." "We just want to leave," Kara pleaded from the middle seat, tears streaming down her face. "Let us go, and we'll never come back. We won't tell anyone. We promise." The old man seemed to consider this, chewing on his lip, looking from us to the beasts. The creatures let out low, synchronized growls, shifting impatiently, their claws digging into the dirt. They were waiting to attack. "I believe you want to leave," the old man said finally. "But these things, once they have your scent, they don't forget it. You've been marked by this place now. You carry the smell of the mountain." He looked us over with a strange kind of pity. "I can let you pass. I can move the tree. But you need to understand something. You leave now, you never return. If any of you set foot on this dirt road again, I won't whistle next time. I'll let 'em feast." We nodded frantically, desperate to agree to anything. "Never again," Ben promised, his voice shaking. "We're done. Just let us go." The old man turned to the creature on his right, the biggest one, and made a sharp, complex hand gesture. Incredibly, the massive beast moved to the fallen pine tree. With strength that defied physics, it hooked its claws under the trunk. Muscles bulged under its fur, and with a grunt of effort, it lifted one end, dragging it just enough to clear a path for the truck. The display of raw power was terrifying. The old man stepped aside and waved us through. Ben didn't hesitate. He gunned the engine and sped through the gap, tires scraping the bark of the fallen tree. I looked back in the side mirror as we sped away. The old man was standing in the middle of the road, flanked by the 3 monsters, watching us go. Their eyes glowed like 6 red coals in the receding darkness until we rounded a bend and they vanished from sight. We didn't stop driving until we hit the first town with a 24-hour diner, 50 miles away. We sat in a vinyl booth under bright fluorescent lights, shivering in the warmth, not speaking. We were safe. We had escaped. The nightmare was over. As I sipped coffee that tasted like heaven, I remembered the journal in my pocket. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. The leather was cracked and stained. I opened it to the last entry, written in faded ink, dated 50 years ago. It was in Ben's uncle's handwriting.
I read it, and the blood drained from my face. November 14th. I finally understand. The things in the woods, the dogmen, they aren't predators, they are prison guards. I found the tunnel entrance behind the waterfall today. The metal door was bent open from the inside. Whatever the natives trapped down there centuries ago, it got out. And these dogmen, they've been trying to hunt it down ever since. God help us, I think it's hiding in my root cellar. My blood ran cold as I looked up at Ben and Kira. The creature on the roof, the sniffing at the trap door, it wasn't trying to get in to eat us. It was trying to get into the cellar to kill whatever was already down there sleeping beneath our feet. And when we opened that trap door to hide, we didn't just escape the dogman, we let the other thing out. And now it was loose in the world.